On Sunday, I tried to tackle the question of how do I know God's will for my life? But in thinking about that question, it also brings up another question that we often have, and that's, how can I hear God speak to me? Is God speaking to me? Is there something that I need to do to be able to hear God more clearly? Well, there's a great story about this person who lived in the country, and they left the country to go visit somebody who was living in New York, a friend of theirs. And so as they were walking down this street with their friend, they suddenly stop and they start to go, "Do you hear that? I hear a cricket." Well, his friend thought he was crazy. There's no way you can hear a cricket in all of this noise. You know, think about New York City, how loud the cars, the people, just the constant noise. But this friend persisted. "No, I hear a cricket. I am sure of it." His friend said, "It's noon. There are thousands of people bustling around. There's cars honking, taxis squealing. I don't believe you can hear a little cricket in all of this noise." But his friend persisted again and started to walk slowly across the street where he found this large cement planter with a shrub in it. He began to dig beneath the leaves, and sure enough, there was a cricket. Well, his friend was stunned, as you can imagine. "You have amazing hearing," he said. But the other friend said, "No, my ears are no different from yours. It simply depends on who or what you're listening to. Here, let me show you." So he reaches into his pocket and he picks up a handful of change, and then he holds it out and he drops it on the concrete. And every head within a block turned. You see what I mean? It all depends on what you're listening for. We live in a society that is full of noise all of the time. I'm sitting down here in the narthex. It is after preschool hours, before all of the meetings begin to happen for the day. And it is actually quiet for once. But this space, even this space, this church space, is filled with noise. And not only the spaces that we live in, but also from things like our media, right? Our cell phones are continually sending us notifications. Our watches now continually notify us on news events that are happening, text messages or phone calls that we're receiving, even notifications from some of those apps that we desperately seek and look at every day. So how do we hear God's voice? How are we able to hear God in our lives? One of my favorite scriptures is from 1 Samuel. He's my favorite kid in the Bible because he is living in the temple. And if you remember Samuel, he is asleep. I think it's 1 Samuel 3, where he is asleep, and all of a sudden he hears someone call his name in the middle of the night. And so he jumps up and he runs over and he says, you called me, but nope, he didn't call you. And so it goes back and forth until finally his trusted person tells him, you are hearing God speak to you. So next time you hear that voice, answer, here I am. Here I am. Speak, for your servant is listening. Right? There are so many times in which we need to be reminded that in the midst of the quiet, we can hear God's voice. It depends on what we are tuned into, on the noises in our lives. Are we setting time aside to hear God speak to us? Are we setting a time aside to be quiet, to have some space for God to speak? Are we allowing for God to enter into our lives, or do we have too many blockades, too many spaces where there are distractions, too many noises in this world? And I'm giggling right now because as I'm recording this, my watch is going off like crazy from text messages from my family. Even in this moment of trying to sit and reflect on how to hear God's voice, others are needing or wanting my attention. So the first thing we have to do is to be able to find space. What does that look like for you? For some people, that's getting up early in the morning before anybody else in the house is awake, before anything else needs to be done for the day. It is having some quiet time. For others who are like me and maybe not morning people, maybe it's going on a quiet walk during the day, just allowing God to speak. Or maybe it's staying up at night after everybody's gone to bed and the day is done, and being able to sit and reflect on the day and then ask God to speak into your life. One of the problems we have is that we forget that conversation is a two-way street, right? So we often pray, we say aloud all of the things that are on our hearts, all of the joys that we have and all of the concerns that we have, and then we just stop and we leave. But God is trying to speak to us. There still might be more that God is trying to say, but we've already gotten up and left the conversation. So whenever we pray, to make sure that we allow space for silence, space for God to speak to us. And then also begin to ask God, very boldly, if you can, to speak, Lord. Speak, for your servant is listening. And if you honestly pray that prayer, and maybe it's a prayer that you begin to pray very often throughout your day. You know, you pray it first thing you wake up, and then you pray it maybe in the middle of the day, and then you pray it at lunch. The more you pray that prayer, the more you are going to be able to be in tune with God who is speaking to you. God who is speaking into our world in every moment. God who is present with us. We just often miss hearing God's voice, miss seeing God at work around us because we're too focused, we're too busy, we're too distracted, and we don't even think to ask God to speak. So what would it be like if you woke up in the morning and you prayed that prayer? Speak, God. Your servant is listening. Speak, God. I'm here. Speak, God. I want to hear your voice. In Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 11, we hear these words from Jesus. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because the hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. See, Jesus knows us. Jesus speaks to us, and us, the people of God, know Jesus's voice. But there's so many messages that bombard us. There's so many things that pull us in the direction that it's really important that we remember God and who God is, who Jesus is. You know, thinking again about God is love. So as we're looking at the world and we maybe think we hear God speak, we also need to ask, you know, is it true? Is it good? Is this something that is beneficial and brings life into the world? Because there are a lot of false sheep out there, right? Sheep's in wolf clothing, and sometimes we get lost and confused. So always, as you are praying and seeking God, remember who God is. Remember that God is love. Remember that everything that is good comes from God. And that is a way in which you can test what you are hearing to make sure that it's not just the coins that are falling onto the concrete, but it is that cricket that is in the planter who is speaking. My friends, it is hard to hear God's voice, especially because it's not like God just sits down here and is having a conversation with us. We have to be proactive. We have to be seeking God's voice in our lives. But we know that if we seek, God is near, and we will be able to find God. So work on that prayer, asking God to speak into your life. And then the words that you hear, make sure that they line up with who God is. You know Jesus. You know Jesus's voice, and Jesus knows you. So allow there to be space for God to speak. Speak, God. Your servants are listening.